Hello, Apes, and welcome to the sixth screencast for Chapter 7, Environmental Policies, Making Decisions, and Solving Problems. So we were talking about some of the prominent laws that followed in a way for the 20th century for environmental protection. We had just finished the Toxic Substances Control Act, and now we're going to look at Resources Conservation and Recovery Act. And what we saw is that the population was growing and the consumption of our natural resources were also growing, and so was the solid waste, and industrial development was also creating hazardous waste that was being proliferated. So this prompted the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that was passed in 1976. And this is a primary federal law that pertains to the disposal of solid waste and hazardous waste. And it sets standards, it mandates permitting procedures, and it requires that hazardous waste be tracked, and they call it from cradle to grave, as it's generated, transported, and disposed of. And you probably are aware that you have hazardous waste collection dates within your communities that you live in. And these consist of oil. You do an oil change on your car, you can't just dump that oil out. Turpentine, paints, any chemicals that you might use around the house that would be considered hazardous. Batteries. Batteries have acid in them, so they're a hazardous waste. And now these new light bulbs that are energy efficient that contain mercury. So this would fall under that category. Then came the Clean Water Act, and prior to the passage of the federal pollution laws, water pollution problems were left largely to the local and state governments, and they were addressed through lawsuits. The flaming waters of the Cayuga River, however, indicated that they needed federal legislation. So, thanks to restrictions on pollutants and because of the Federal Water Pollution Control Acts of 1965 and 1972, and then the Clean Water Act in 1977, our waterways began to recover. The Clean Water Act regulates what is discharged as wastes, especially from industry, into rivers and streams, and it aims to protect wildlife as well as human health and to establish a system of granting permits for the discharge of pollutants. So these pollutants, when we say discharge, they have to go through a filtration process. We're going to go to a wastewater management plant in the spring, and you're going to see how this brown muck from our houses, from what we generate, actually gets changed into clean water, and companies are responsible for filtering the water and cleaning the water before they put it into our river systems. Okay, so here's a list of our key environmental laws from 1963 to 1980. I'm not going to read them over. You can take a look at those laws and the dates. So the social context for our policies have actually evolved over time. You know what? I think we missed one. Sorry. I don't know how we missed this. I want to go back. The Soil and Water Conservation Act of 1977, which directs the Department of Agriculture to assess soil and water conditions across the country and to prepare for national plans of conservation. We will discuss the soil and do some labs on soil, but farming and policymakers learned a lot of lessons about conserving topsoil as a result of the Dust Bowl. And that was where we had cut down so many trees and we were farming on soil that it just dried out and eroded, and it created this giant dust bowl. So the Soil and Water Conservation Act was passed in 1977, and it directs the U.S. Department of Agriculture to survey and assess soil and water conditions across the nation periodically and prepare national plans for conservation. The results have been mixed, but the country has seen many success stories in the soil and water conservation as a result. And we're going to talk about some interesting things and see some video clips that you'll find interesting on this. Then there's something called the CERCLA, which is the Superfund. And this was established in 1980 when the U.S. was spotted with thousands of sites where years of unregulated pollution had severely contaminated the land and the water. There were highly publicized incidences of buried hazardous waste threatening people's health, and there were locations that you might have heard of, like Love Canal in New York, that led Congress that year to pass a comprehensive environmental response, compensation, and liability act, CERCLA, commonly called the Superfund Act. This law provides a fund program to clean up hazardous waste from the nation's worst polluted sites. And the costs have been staggering, but the EPA continues to progress through the many sites that remain. In the 1980s, Congress strengthened and broadened and elaborated upon the laws of the 70s. For example, the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act today have thousands of federal, state, and local laws that help to regulate and protect them here in the States and abroad. And public enthusiasm for environmental protection remains strong. People are overwhelmingly in favor of our environmental protection. So, okay. Now here's that chart, and now we're going to look at the policy in terms of the social context and how it has evolved over time. So historians suggest that major advances in environmental policy really occurred in the 1960s and the 1970s. And it happened because there was a lot of evidence from environmental problems that we discussed, and people could actually see what the problem was and how the policies needed to deal with those problems. The political climate at that time was very good and supportive. There were public leaders that were also willing to act on these policies. So at this time, too, we were sending people into space, and NASA was coming back with images of the entire Earth. And those images became widely available. And when people saw the Earth for the first time, they saw their planet as a finite planet rather than an infinite planet for their supplies. So this changed the whole way of thinking. So we saw that by 1990s, the political climate in the United States had changed. The public support for the goals of the environmental protection still remained high, but many citizens and policy experts started to feel that the legislative and regulatory means to achieve these goals was just too high. They imposed too much economic burdens on businesses and on individuals. So there were attempts to make the federal level to roll back or weaken the environmental laws, and this began with the Ronald Reagan administration and culminated in an array of efforts with the George Bush administration and Congress as well from 1994 to 2006. So in 2004, we see that an essay was written, The Death of Environmentalism, and it stated that the environmental movement had to be reinvented. Two political consultants, Michael Schellenberg and Ted Nordhaus, they argued that environmental advocates need to appeal to people's core values and not simply offer technical policy fixes. And they needed to stop labeling problems as environmental and start showing people why these problems are actually human issues that lie at the heart of their quality of life. They needed people to be more responsive, and they needed to articulate a positive, inspiring version for the future. Schellenberg and Nordhaus suggested their views were very open and productive in discussion, and in 2008, Barack Obama embraced a similar approach in his presidential campaign. So today in the United States, legal protections for public health and environmental quality still remain strong in some areas, but they have eroded in other areas. The energy issues move to the foreground, and people will continue to experience impacts from fossil fuel use and extraction while striving to find a path toward cleaner energy as one of the issues. Fracking is exempt from the key aspects of the National Environmental Policy, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act and the Superfund Act, and even the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. So we still have some things that are exempt from this. So looking at this, we need to consider environmental policy and how it advances today and on an international stage as well, not just on the U.S. stage. So other nations have really taken over leadership on some of the issues through research and progressive environmental policies. We'll be talking about several countries that are going above and beyond what American policy had done. This will then focus on the fourth wave of policies and sustainability and sustainable development, where we are today. We'll look at the world community, how it's come together to address the issues. In 1992, there was the World Summit, the Earth Summit, I should say, that came about. This happened in Rio de Janeiro. And the idea was that they wanted to safeguard environmental quality at this conference. In 2002, it went to the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and this took place in Johannesburg, South Africa, and had 200 nations that participated in this. One of the pressing issues that they discussed was climate change, and we'll talk about that in a later chapter. And that has been one of the prominent global discussions, is this change in climate. So there's been a series of international conferences that have taken place over the time, and in recent years it's brought representatives of all the world's nations trying to come together to figure out how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, because that's one of the biggest problems that we're facing. We also need to consider the social, economic, and ecological effects of climate change, other environmental impacts, and environmental policies. So these are going to be the central part of the governments of everyday life for the future. We'll end this screencast here. Boy, these are just flying by, and we'll start with international environmental policy in the next screencast.